Hello, my name is Dr. Jim Doty, and I'm the host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast, where we explore the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. Hi, this is Dr. Jim Doty, host of the Into the Magic Shop podcast. My guest today is Dacher Keltner, who's a psychology professor at the University of California, Berkeley, where he directs the Social Interaction Lab. He's the founder and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center, as well as chief scientific advisor to Hume AI. He also hosts a podcast called The Science of Happiness. He's the author of several best-selling books, including, most recently, Awe, the New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life. His research work is focused on the biological and evolutionary origins of compassion, awe, love, beauty, power, social class, and social inequality. And these are some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. Thank you for being with me, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Dacher, it's so great to see you, and thanks for coming on my podcast here. I appreciate it.
It's good to be with you, Jim, as always.
Well, it's been a little while, actually, and
Yeah.
I know there's been a lot going on with your new book, which obviously we'll talk about somewhat. And but I'm going to try to cover a few things. And actually, one of the things I thought was sort of interesting is actually your early background, and which, of course, some people might find unusual, but perhaps if we looked at all of our backgrounds, they would be unusual. But maybe you can, you were born in Jalisco, Mexico, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was born in 1961, as was my brother was born a year later in Jalisco, Mexico, in Ajijic, which is near a town near Lake Chapala. And I was born in my mom tells me, a one-room, medical unit. My mom and dad were early counterculture, and they, my dad became an artist. My mom taught poetry and literature at a state university, but they were, believe it or not, they were 23 and they ran out of money. They were in New Orleans, and a former professor of theirs had this house that they could stay in Mexico. And so they moved down there and lived for free in this Mexican town. The more remarkable part of the story, in some sense, is when I was born, my two grandmothers got into a car and drove there to see this grandchild. But yeah, I was born in Mexico. I lived there 3 years. And it's interesting, Jim, my dad grew up in a part of LA that was largely Mexican-American. And then I did too. I've always had a very close relationship to Mexico and really value it.
Wow, that's wonderful. Actually, interestingly enough, I gave a talk, not surprisingly, on compassion at the first Congress of Psychology and Psychotherapists in Puebla, Mexico, recently.
No, I know, and we have a lot to learn from them, and they us. And one of my highest achievements was one of my most cherished PhD students, Belinda Campos, who's from Mexico, and now is a professor at UC Irvine. She called me an honorary Mexican. That
is a high honor.
I have the soul of Mexico. So.
Yes. Well, that's funny you mentioned Irvine, because that's where I went to undergraduate. So all these connections. Yes, I was a rower in college as well as a lifeguard. So while theoretically I went to college, I was a rower and a lifeguard.
You were near bodies of water.
Yes. Well, I know there's this long, incredible history. And before we talk about your book, I just wanted to go over a few other things that have sort of always interested me. And, one is this concept of, I don't know if it's social justice, social equality, the nature of power. And obviously, you're a world-renowned expert in compassion. But what do you think are the drivers of sort of the separation between individuals versus what I would say is our common humanity?
Yeah, and Jim, you and I share this like background of growing up poor and making our way in the world. And thanks for bringing up our work on power and my book, The Power Paradox. The For 20 years, I've studied inequality and power and so forth, and its effects upon justice and connection. And it really came out of a personal experience where I was growing up in a middle class neighborhood, and my parents moved from Mexico to LA, and I was in Laurel Canyon, which at the time, late 60s, was a middle class neighborhood. Now it's fancier. And we moved to this really poor town in the country, in the foothills of the Sierras. And it just was astonishing me to go from fourth grade in a middle class neighborhood to fifth grade in a very poor school, and just to see the effects of inequality and poverty on the nervous system and the body and the ability to concentrate and what kids ate and how their bones broke. And to me, that's the great, that's really what divides people, and the ideologies that come out of inequality and power and class, how we separate people into those who are extraordinary and the rest of the world, and then just the basic structural effects that that really prevent kids that I was now growing up around from fulfilling their promise in many ways. So I really appreciate, and it's always important when we talk about concepts like compassion or awe that are lofty moral sentiments, that we remember that sometimes life gets in the way of our ability to pursue those emotions and those sentiments, and it's costly. Just to think about economic inequality, power abuses, structural issues as things that divide us and blind us to our common humanity.
No, I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't appreciate is their unconscious biases, and how it's something that unfortunately impacts every decision they make and every
Yeah.
interaction. It's always sort of interested me, and just as a side note, I just did an interview with Marianne Williamson, uh, who I'm sure you probably at least share some of her views on some of the challenges that are happening
Yeah.
in America and that in fact separate us. And it I don't know if it's the history of America in terms of this idea of rugged individualism
Yeah.
and this notion that if you didn't make it, it's your fault. And that sort of always fascinates me. As you
Yeah.
pointed out, we've lost so many people. Many of my friends growing up,
Yeah.
um, they got lost. They
Yeah.
had no resources, no
Yeah.
mentors. They got into drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
people don't appreciate how powerful
Yeah.
poverty is
Yeah.
in terms of ruining a life.
It's profound, and the same thing with some of the kids I grew up around, and it is this blindness to the power of life contexts that the United States specializes in. With we're the most individualistic culture in the world, and we think everybody should make it, and we lose sight of the kinds of things we need to give to all citizens that keep us, that bring a strong sense of common humanity. Which I love your phrase.
Well, and I think that's why it's challenging, because I'm sure you appreciate if you imbue sort of compassion and caring for the other into every action. This is essentially inexpensive way to help everyone
Yeah.
versus creating situations, as an example, a private prison system that they want the prisons full for sort of, I always call it ruthless capitalism. And these narratives where somehow removing social services, childcare, feeding children, not dealing with homelessness appropriately with compassion, it only exacerbates the problem and it becomes much, much more expensive exponentially, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I've so admired your work over the years, and just this deep commitment to, like, if we can commit to compassion and tending to those in need who are vulnerable, a lot of things go better. and then you have to start thinking about what are the systemic processes, the ideologies that get in the way of that. And, our work showed that, boy, once you think you're privileged and special and extraordinary, which is an outgrowth of American individualism, you lose your compassion, and then suddenly you're in this vicious cycle of like, the poor don't need good schools, we should be able to create them on our own. You don't need resources for that. And so, yeah, I always look for powerful, animating sentiments like compassion that can do some good in the world if you seed it in the right way. And I think compassion is probably our best success story in that. And hopefully all will be the next one. So
yes. Well, I'm sure we could go on this topic, but maybe if one person in power or with the level of wealth
yeah,
can sort of see beyond themselves,
yeah.
maybe at least this conversation will have done some good, at least in one arena. Uh,
And just on that, Jim, it's worth, it's always important to return to, if we have resources, what we can do. And there's this Atlantic Monthly article, and I can't remember when it was, and we can find the citation, where they just asked the question, if the wealthiest citizen of each country in the world devoted some proportion of their resources to that country, how big a dent would you make in poverty? And it's extraordinary.
there would be no poverty.
Yeah, exactly. So no, it's worth provoking on that theme of like, let's get to work on that.
Yeah, and I have a challenge because I have worked not to let my emotions get out of control, and to sort of have this equanimity. But these types of issues that cause so much suffering, when you
Yeah,
see, the wealthy on their $500 million yacht,
yeah,
and have 10 homes that sit empty, and
yeah,
you have children who can't, who are hungry. I
yeah.
mean, it's obscene,
It's obscene.
and it's painful.
Yeah,
But so
keep making.
hopefully,
Yeah, I agree.
well, perhaps we should go to more esoteric and high level things that
Yeah,
maybe evoke a slightly different sentiment. But you've got this incredible body of work, and uh, just to get back to this topic a little bit, you wrote this book, Born to Be Good: The Science of a Meaningful Life. And I think it does intersect this idea of awe, in the sense that uh, I believe meaning comes from being involved with things that are bigger than yourself.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and I love Jane Goodall's quote that I came across in writing Awe, which is, uh, just awe is about being amazed at things outside of yourself that are big, and if there's a thesis in some sense of the Awe book, it is, as I was sort of putting together all these ideas and interviews and findings about awe, this is an emotion that connects the individual to the big sources of meaning in life: a political cause, a moral cause, a piece of music, the ecosystem, etc. And today, and you rightly frame the question, Jim. We now have this science of a meaningful life, which I tried to summarize a bit in Born to Be Good. And it really is not about individual pleasure or relationships. It's really fundamentally about the big themes of life you want to be involved in. Where do they come from in your family history? What do they do for the world? For some people, it might be a spiritual idea, or playing music for the masses, or helping the ecosystem, or working on prisons. And awe is a part of this puzzle of meaning. What gives us this sense of higher purpose? And I started to hint at that, as you observed in 2009 in Born to Be Good. I said, hey, there are these emotions like compassion and gratitude and awe that they're different than personal pleasures, than eating ice cream or sitting in a hot tub. They kind of get you to be part of something large. And then that thesis has continued in the work on awe.
But it's interesting, and maybe it's even a paradox, that
Yeah.
is a individual perception of something bigger than themselves. Can that be distorted, though, through, if you will, their own biases to actually embrace something? As an example, you mentioned politics, a political
Yeah.
ideology
Yeah.
that actually is extraordinarily damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, the general structure of this sense of meaning, is you have a sense of yourself, and then you feel connected and animated by and contributing to something, some larger, what I write about as a system, like this political anti-war movement, or how I help clean beaches in an environmentalist movement, et cetera, or I'm part of a church. And that's the feeling that makes you feel like Jane Goodall said, like, wow, I am amazed that I'm part of this thing that's larger than this self. But of course, those can be very dangerous and pernicious. Nazism, QAnon conspiracy theories, Trump rallies for certain people of a political perspective. I was always struck in reading about the massacres of Rwanda and how the Hutus, the massacres began in these chants and dancing and synchronized movement and collective effervescence. And it probably was awe-inspiring, but led to 800,000, 600,000 deaths. So yeah, these moral sentiments, Jim, even compassion, I hate to tell you, can can lead us astray. And we have to, as a society, discuss and debate.
Well, I think that's an interesting comment, discuss and debate. I mean, yeah, I have heard people who, we look at Bush's term, what was it,
Yeah.
conscious or compassionate conservatism,
Yep. Yep.
and how that's been distorted. And in some
Yeah.
ways, it's like white nationalism.
Yeah.
How do you start out, or Christian white nationalism, where you start out with the tenets of Jesus, and
Yeah.
somehow this gets distorted to racism, separation, privilege, and fundamentally hate.
Yeah.
And even you see people, as an example, interviewing individuals, and I'm not just picking on the right, because I think it can
Yeah.
also be on the left, but
Yeah.
they're talking about things that objectively, frankly, are obvious, and these people will bend themselves into knots to justify their perspective.
Yeah. No, and that's an example of like looking at the abuses of the deeper ethical orientation of compassion, which I believe does lead, as the science suggests in your own writing, to more good in the world. The same is true of awe, right? It's an amazing emotion that can make you sacrifice and humble and give to the people around you. All good. But, what if that's in the service of fascism, or that's in the service of environmentally destructive behavior, or a religious cult that leads to suicides of many. So it's always a paradox, as you said earlier, and complex. Where our deep tendencies lead us.
Well, and that's maybe another question
Yeah.
is, many of us from our childhoods carry baggage that, again, may not be at the surface, that imbue us with behaviors, perspectives that frankly
Yeah.
impact every decision we make.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say then that a lot of these behaviors, or even attachments to negative behaviors, can, by one's childhood, can make them prone to attach to them?
Yeah, I really, and I think this is really worrisome when we get to these deep, deep moral sentiments, if you will, or emotions, or moral passions, moral emotions, as John Haidt refers to them, of compassion, awe, gratitude. And to think about what are the early childhood conditions and social contexts and precursors that cultivate these states. One of the things I think people are really worried about with respect to early childhood today is its extraordinary focus on the self, right? And just like self-focus, I'm a separate individual. Look at my selfie I'm posting about on Instagram. I'm comparing myself to others. as an enemy of these moral sentiments that are so important to healthy societies, like compassion and awe. And, I write about how, this one cultural strain of self-focus has, we now know, produced a lot of anxiety and depression in young people. And I believe, grounded in the studies of compassion and awe and things like that, that's where we need to be shifting culturally and be thinking about these early childhood influences that we can change in schools and so forth.
Well, I read a survey, and the number may be slightly off, but it said like something 78% of high school students want to be influencers.
Ah, oh my God. Yeah, and I'll complement that with there's work on role models, people who inspire admiration and awe in us. And it was something like 40 to 50% of high schoolers could not name a single role model, right? So they're not thinking about, some figure who's changing the world, Greta Thunberg or what have you. Rather, they're thinking about how I can be an influencer to this ridiculously small market that they'll eventually have. So we need a cultural shift, right, out of self-focus to the beauties of other people, and it's worrisome.
Well, I think that's also combined with uh, judgment, or at least the
Yeah,
sense that every action
yeah,
you take is being judged by some external thing, and
yeah,
being so focused on that versus having a sense of self. As you
yeah,
well know, I mean, we talk about happiness, and I can tell you from my own experience, I used to be focused on, well, if I can just become this, if I can become a doctor, if I can become a neurosurgeon, if I can be a successful entrepreneur, then my uh, insecurity, my shame, it's all going to go away, and people are going to admire me. And of course, at the top of every one of those peaks is nothing.
yeah,
And it, I think, reinforces the reality that only you can give yourself happiness.
yeah, yeah. And then alongside that is we have to think very carefully about how we're pursuing it, And I think one of the lessons of studying awe is it's this animator of growth and a sense of common humanity, to use a phrase you used earlier, and a sense of purpose, right? It doesn't need a lot of resources. And you contrast that with, oh, I'm pursuing happiness through the American ideology of ever increasing material wealth, which leads us astray. And I think that this science gives us some guidelines to how to engage in that great pursuit of where we find meaning and happiness.
Well, no, I think that's right. This focus on self, I think, unfortunately, is a dead end path to
Yeah,
unhappiness, misery, and further sense of insecurity
yeah,
because you don't feel you can measure up. And this, I think, gets to this narrative of self compassion.
yeah, yeah. Um, the it was interesting studying compassion all those years in the lab, Jim, and like, wow, if you practice a little kindness, things go pretty well. Your nervous system looks better, as you know, and your volume reviewing the literature on compassion is just a tour de force on that's just, we can trust that. And then along comes this idea of self-compassion that, when you think about all the societal forces that are making us shame ourselves and condemn ourselves and say we don't weigh the right amounts or have the right pocketbook balance, etc. And self-compassion comes along and it's just like, just we all fail. We're all prone to errors. We do our best, be kind. And God, when I first started teaching that 10, 15 years ago, I mean, people just would start crying. And I was like, this message needs to get out. And it's this wonderful companion to the fundamentals of compassion that we need more of today.
No, it's interesting how that works. As I'm sure you know, I mean, I give these talks periodically, and I'll tell a story, and my voice will crack or I'll shed a tear, and it's fascinating because until that point happens, everybody's sitting there and when that happens, though, they immediately start crying or connect with themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people are so terrified of sitting with their emotions, and it's very sad.
Yeah.
Um, it's funny. I gave a talk one time, and a woman comes up to me. She goes, "Man, you must have been so embarrassed up there. Your voice cracked. I could see a tear, and that must have been horrible for you. All these people looking at you and judging you." And she says, she says to me, "Listen, I'm a psychiatrist and also an expert in hypnosis. If you come to me for 3 sessions, I'll get rid of that for you."
I think it's the opposite of what we need to do. I mean, it's interesting, Jim. One of the neat discoveries in writing Awe was this book was people tear up a lot when they feel awe. They like when you see somebody else's kindness, you tear up. When you see somebody else's compassion, you tear up. And those tears, very subtle scientific studies are showing by Alan Fiske at UCLA, aren't about weakness or loss. They're about common humanity and sharing things that are part of the human condition. So your tears on stage aren't, I'm lost and alienated. Rather, they're signs of we're all sharing something that's fundamentally human, like recognizing we can overcome obstacles or find a sense of purpose. And so I disagree with your psychiatrist diagnosis is all I have to say. Yet again.
Well, talking about psychiatry is a whole different
Don't get
conversation. Actually, there's have you heard this quote by Washington Irving?
No.
It says, "There's a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They're the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love."
So thank you. I'm writing that down, and we'll use that. That gets to the point.
Yes, and I find that a very powerful quote. In your book, and I should probably say the title, since I'm sure your publisher or your publicist would like that.
They'll be happy about that.
So Dacher's new book is called Awe, the New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life, which, in fact, it can. But you talk about indigenous peoples and their wisdom on some level, and maybe you could just comment on that and how powerful that is, because so often, and I think, unfortunately, it's been a historical reality that white folk, whether it be Europeans or Americans, have dismissed some of the greatest wisdom traditions. And in fact, as we are seeing, that wisdom gained over thousands of years not only correlates with science, but in fact is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Thank you deeply for asking about that, because you're one of the first to remind us of this. Yeah, awe is a self-transcendent emotion. It's, you encounter vast mysteries you don't understand, and it leads you to feel connected to big things in the world. And in point of fact, and this really was in conversation with Dr. Yuria Salidwin, who's at the United Nations and soon to be at Berkeley. She's got extraordinary research going on the centrality of this idea of awe and self-transcendence in almost all of the indigenous cultures. There are 5,000 indigenous societies. I think they make up 460 to 500 million people. There have overcome genocide everywhere, as we know. They largely had oral traditions, and Yuria is beginning this large-scale project to translate it and build it into written records and sort of curate the knowledge of those extraordinary traditions, tens of thousands of years old. And at the core is this idea of what she calls kin relationality, which is we aren't separate individuals, we're part of collectives. Fundamentally, we are made up of other people. And that's awe-inspiring and relates to things we study in Western science related to awe, like being moved by somebody's moral beauty, being part of a collective. And then her very rich idea of ecological belonging, which is I am part of nature, and when I get out and have awe in the natural world from a rainstorm or the blossoms of spring or a forest, and I just feel vibrating with awe and dissolving in myself, sense of self. What the indigenous peoples tell us is you're fundamentally nature, right? You aren't looking at nature as a human. You're just part of an ecosystem, which is true. We lost sight of that in the Western mind, and the indigenous peoples have long known this for thousands of years. So through the book, in different places, I relied on this remarkable new scholarship of people like Uriah Selidwin, who are starting to chart these ethical principles that really I found almost astonishing, that they've worked this out ethically and located the emotions in these deep beliefs. And now Western science comes along very clumsily, and it's like, oh, I think we're starting to say the same thing. So that was one of the most exciting convergences in writing the book, was to get to that.
Yeah, actually, I've gotten to know Uriah a little bit, and maybe we should just spell her name out. It's Uriah,
Yeah,
Yuria, and her last name is Selidwen, which is Celidwen. But she's a remarkable human being. And this idea of the power of indigenous cultures
yeah,
is really quite extraordinary if you look into it. And of
yeah,
course, the sad thing is, again,
yeah,
the nature historically of biases related to, frankly, Western civilization
yeah.
that has devalued this type of wisdom. It's sort of,
It's
oh, go
It's
ahead.
ridiculous. Well, it's ridiculous, that, I mean, this is wisdom. Uriah makes the point, and you can go to our website, that there are scientific groundings of this wisdom where they're gathering data and making observations and testing them and so forth in different ways than Western science. But it's so rich, and she's recently published. I'd really advise our listeners to go to her Lancet article on spirit medicines or psychedelics, because yet again, the West comes in and there's all this money at play in the spirit medicine psychedelic movement, and they're extracting indigenous knowledge, turning it into training programs, paying nice salaries for, and not giving due credit or benefits to indigenous peoples who these traditions come out of. So it's really timely for us to be thinking about this. And thank you, Jim, for always having social justice be part of your conversation. Seriously, I appreciate it.
Uh,
UriahSelidwin.com.
yes. Uh, Well, one of the things I find fascinating actually is, of course, as we all know, Buddhist practice has been at the forefront for the last few decades, in part because
Yeah,
of John Kabat-Zinn and a variety of other people. But again, it's the exact same thing. You have this wisdom
yeah,
that has occurred over thousands of years through experiential experience. And
yeah,
of course, what happens, dogmas typically attach, whether it's
yep,
Buddhism or
yep,
Hinduism or other types of practices. And but at the core is fact. And what I mean
yeah,
by that is that through repeated experience over thousands of years, they have learned incredible knowledge. And we are seeing how science now confirms what this experience has shown for a long, long time. And I think the other thing you point out is, sadly, the extractive nature of capitalism,
yeah,
which is the people who founded these things, the people who have been at the forefront, their cultures for thousands of years,
yeah,
are not receiving not only the recognition, but also the incredible financial
yeah,
aspects of this that unfortunately, again, go into the pockets of the powerful. This is a very sad thing. It
yeah.
always fascinates me, and I'll go on my diatribe for a minute or two. which
I
is
love your diatribe, Jim.
which is, you have Davos, we have this immense gathering of the wealthiest people in the world. And I don't know if you've heard this saying by Tolstoy. I'll paraphrase it since my memory's not so good, but it says something like, there is a man on your back choking you.
Yeah.
He acknowledges he's on your back choking you, but he never offers to get off your back and stop choking you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the nature of privilege, right? If
Yeah.
anybody questions your privilege, then you feel oppressed. And it's fascinating to hear this narrative where we've been given corporate welfare for many, many years. And we've seen decimation of the middle class by the greed of the corporate
Yeah.
entities and extraordinarily wealthy people. And then, if you ever make a comment about this is unjust, it's saying, "Oh, you're talking about socialism, right?"
Yeah.
And it's sort of a
Yeah.
fascinating
Yeah.
narrative.
Yeah. All you have to do is read, Michael Lewis's account of, the 2008 economic collapse, where a lot of people made a lot of money, a lot of middle class people lost a lot of money, and I think one person went to prison. So, and he calls it socialism. Our government is socialism for the rich, and
Uh, uh,
he should get
it-
credit for that. Yeah, but your point again, and I just want to, call this to our collective attention, which is that, part of our work is to raise the profile of these deep evolved tendencies that do a lot of good for the world that we need: awe, compassion, gratitude, beauty. But those always take place within social structures, and we have to be attentive. And the mindfulness movement doesn't do enough of this work. The awe movement probably does not. Positive psychology does not. Which is, what are the social structural factors that abuse these human qualities? Economic inequality, privilege, racism, sexism, etc., bias against indigenous peoples, the genocide against indigenous peoples. So I hear you, and I worry about awe, Jim. There's going to be a commodification of awe. Parts of the psychedelic movement commodify awe, make a lot of money on it. And that's why one of my heroes of the book is Ralph Waldo Emerson, because he felt the same. And he stood up to the Harvard Divinity School professors and he gave a speech that led him to get fired, that, we can't institutionalize and make money off human goodness. We have to let humans do it on their own. And I think in some fundamental way, he's right, that the mindfulness movement's got a little too corporate. That will happen with awe, gratitude, self-compassion. So we need to promote it in ways that are democratic.
Uh, Speaking of that, it's always interesting because you look at raising children,
Yeah.
and there's been a tendency, I think, of saying, well, if you do this, I'll pay you, whether
Yeah.
it's a chore or whether doing good, which actually is the complete opposite of
Yep.
what we should be doing. Because
Yeah.
when you put it in that narrative, again, a child somehow expects to be paid for being kind and compassionate and
Yeah.
thoughtful, versus understanding that that is something that actually provides you an immense amount of wealth, but in a different way.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of people who are raising children today really feel the pressures of, how pressurized schools are, whether they're pressurized in nice neighborhoods where there's academic pressure, or they're pressurized because there aren't enough resources to provide a safe context for school. So there's a lot of academic pressure, digital pressure, societal pressure on young people, and we're seeing it in this mental health crisis. And that really, begs the question of what are our approaches as parents to cultivate things like compassion and awe. And in writing Awe, one of my heroes became Rachel Carson, this great environmentalist, and she wrote very passionately about how society can really dull these wonderful things like compassion and awe. And here's what we can do to bring it back, right? Teach kids mystery, teach them things that they feel awestruck about that maybe they aren't necessarily about math and engineering. We got to return to that. I think, for the health of our kids. And there are some new lessons to how to do it.
No, I think that's exactly right. Uh, you wrote a paper with, is it Pfeiffer?
Paul Piff?
Piff, yeah, on empathy and how I think the wealthy lose a sense of empathy. Maybe you could
Yeah.
comment on that.
Yeah. I have long, growing up as I did and having this odd life experience of going from a middle class, thriving school to this poor area. I was like, what's going on? And then it took me a long time to realize that it was really about poverty and class and power. And so I started to do a lot of work on hierarchy and what privilege does to us, what social class does to us. By that, I mean your wealth and education and rank in society or prestige. And, we, in the mid 2010s, started to generate all these findings, and it's not a pretty picture, which is, if you have privilege and wealth, you feel less empathy, you judge emotions less accurately. That's replicated. You feel less compassion for people who are suffering, like kids with cancer. The vagus nerve is activated less, this bundle of nerves that supports compassionate behavior. You share less with a stranger. You keep more for yourself. You take more candy that's meant for kids in an experiment. So, it started to tell us that, and you began our conversation with this question of what divides us, what prevents us from seeing our common humanity and feeling it in empathy and compassion. And you have to put up on that list of dividers privilege, that places of privilege undermine our sense of compassion and empathy and a sense of common humanity. And I will add, Paul Piff went on to publish with Jake Moskowitz, the poorer you are, the more you feel awe on a regular basis, the more you feel like you're part of something large and meaningful. And so those are lessons to the perils of privilege that I think you and I have long spoken about. No one listens to us.
A few people do. A few people.
Maybe, but man, is that a hard fight to fight. So,
Well,
but yes.
It's interesting you say that because, in fact, actually, you mentioned some time ago that was it Mackenzie Bezos
Uh-huh.
made a donation to the Greater Good Center, which was
Yes.
unexpected, out of the blue, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so here's this person who's extraordinarily wealthy,
Yeah.
who finds individuals who are doing good in the world and just makes a donation without restrictions, recognizing that the work that's being done has incredible power to change society. Where are all those people? It's funny. I have an individual who's been somewhat supportive of my work, and over maybe 10 years has donated several $100,000. But the reality is he's worth $3 or $4 billion.
Yeah.
And you sit there and you go, uh, it would not even be noted, I mean, at all, if you gave 10 times that or 20 times that.
Yeah.
And there's so many people in the world who hold on so tightly because wealth doesn't give a sense of generosity. It gives a sense of scarcity, which I find just the most fascinating thing in the world.
It's perverse that happens. I know that. And not only that, but, and we've done research on this as well, which is that, and it's part of your empathy question, Jim, that wealth and privilege, they just dull your eye or your lens onto the needs of the world, and you just don't see it. You don't think it exists. We have data showing the privilege underestimate how much poverty there is in the world and around them. And you could think of obvious reasons why. You just don't see the vulnerability and the need and the harm that acts of charity really fundamentally should be redressing. And so it's a serious problem in our culture. It really is.
Do you remember Werner Erhard?
Yeah. I mean, I remember the Est movement, and I don't know too much about it, but I do remember the name.
Well, it's funny. Werner is almost 88.
Oh.
And over the last few years, he's become a good friend of mine, strangely
Oh,
enough.
that's amazing.
Yeah, no, he's well, and if you know anything about him, actually, he's quite fastidious. He's
Is he
always
really?
dressed immaculately. He sits up straight. He's very loud and direct. And
Uh-huh.
but that being said, I've gotten drunk with him numerous times. So,
Good.
but the reason I bring his name up is, he started the Hunger Project many years ago.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
in fact, Lynn Twist, who you probably know, was involved in that.
I love that. Yeah.
But we should, I think, have another hunger project, right?
Hmm.
And where we actually try to motivate individuals who have those means to contribute to dealing with hunger and homelessness
Yeah.
in this world.
Yeah.
And
I know.
again, it's such a small percentage of their wealth that would be required to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I always try to think of what is it that would move that needle.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, somebody has to go through an event that's profound, that's deep, that's brings them back to the point where they see how they need other people.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
unfortunately, a lot of the people in that class of the 0.001%, it's very hard to have that happen.
Yeah. It
But
is.
I think that's a very, very important
I agree.
thing. So,
I agree. 100%.
well, where shall we go now, Dacher?
Wherever you want.
um, Speaking of nature,
Yeah.
I think it is sort of fascinating because we came from nature. How simply, and I think I read an article where an hour in nature a week, even that has a profound effect on not only your mental health but your physical health.
Yeah. When I in this book, Awe, let me back up a step. It's interesting, the question of health. Um, I wrote this book because I was really struggling personally. My brother died. He was, fundamental to my sense of meaning in life. He died of colon cancer. And like a lot of people who are not faring well in the United States, I had a hyperinflamed body. I was eating poorly. I was sleeping. Was terrible. I felt disoriented and anxious, and I turned to nature. As in the book, I write about 8 sources of awe. One of them is moral beauty, which is just the kindness of people, how extraordinary it is, how common it is. But nature is right up there, right? All the world's traditions, all the countries that we've surveyed, about 30, people just feel fundamentally moved and transformed by nature. The indigenous peoples really, and people like Uriah Solidwin's ecological belonging, this is a fundamental relation to the world, is our relation to nature. And indeed, scholars like Ming Kuo have detailed how, 21 different pathways by which just being in nature changes you. It changes your sense of self. You feel less stressed. You feel your immune system looks better, lower cortisol, different brain functioning, better concentration, a sense of awe and wonder about your life, a sense of community. We find if you feel, it's so interesting, Jim, if you go out by yourself and get a good dose of nature in a park or gardening or looking at trees, you will come back feeling like you love humans more. You haven't seen a human, you haven't been around humans, but you feel a sense of common humanity. And that was my first move, is to, in my personal struggles, losing my brother, as I wrote this book, I was like, I just got to get out into the mountains and listen to water and look at the sky. And, I think that data is fundamental to the health of our culture, which is, an hour a week, 10 minutes a day of nature. To me, it's hard to imagine. Sleep, good diet, social community, and then nature would be my prescriptions. And it's right at the top of the list.
And sleep.
Yeah. which that's a whole other issue.
Indeed, indeed. Uh, well, that's interesting. But it's sad that
Yeah,
I think that's why it's important to have it as an example in cities to have
yeah,
parks and places
yeah,
where people can go because that fundamental connection
yeah,
and I guess you could say even that is ineffable, as a
yeah,
term you like to use, is incredibly powerful. And actually, you talk about your eight wonders. I'll list them since I don't know how you could remember them. I have to look at them, but uh, nature, collective movement, visual design, mystical experiences, life and death, epiphanies, and the courage of and kindness of other people. And that's another interesting thing, this idea of the kindness of other people, people stepping in when you're in need. I have given a talk and I frequently use the example when we think about things that have impacted our lives, oftentimes it's one of two things. It's either when you were in a position where you had wanted something extraordinarily badly and you had used every resource you had
yeah,
and it was not happening.
yeah,
And when you're in that position, at least for me, I sit there and say, it's like the sun goes away, it's dark, you don't believe in God, you think the world is ultimately unjust. And then at the last minute, if someone steps in
yeah,
and gives you whatever it is you desperately wanted, within a microsecond,
yeah,
the clouds part, the sun is shining, you believe in a just God again, and you think the world is the right place. And it's amazing how that can happen. And conversely, I think some of the experiences that people that stay with them, far beyond many things in which we get transitory pleasure, hedonic
yeah,
pleasure, is when you have been that person who stepped in
yeah, yeah,
and saved somebody.
yeah,
And it's like when you think back and you just sit with that emotion, again, it brings this idea of common humanity, but being of service, helping others, being present for them. I think that those two things are incredibly powerful. And if you sit with what that brings to you emotionally,
yeah.
it changes things.
It does, uh, and I suspect you have wonderful examples of that from neurosurgery. But yeah, not only is compassion and sacrifice and courage and overcoming, remarkable in their own right, but one of the things that the science of awe has really revealed is how powerful they are in witnessing and observing not only in yourself, but hearing stories of other people's sacrifice and courage and overcoming. And, that is, it turns out in our research, the most universal source of awe alongside nature is people who overcome poverty to do great things in the world, who overcome a physical ailment, who give away a lot of resources. Our billionaires out there, they should know with those large gifts to the world, a lot of people are inspired, right? Morally inspired. And what's interesting to me, and I think it's still a bit of a mystery, Jim, is like you said, those experiences of your own sacrifice and then witnessing others sacrifice and courage are transformative. There are very few things that change us forever, right? That aren't related to death and so forth. But this is one. This is a kind of experience, the witnessing of moral beauty, the enactment, embodiment of moral beauty that will stay with you forever. And how that is, why it's so powerful, why seeing something on TV or art that's about moral beauty and courage, and that I suddenly am inspired for years. That's pretty interesting to think about how that works, and we don't know. And so that's why we do this research and have these conversations, is to point out what's remarkable about us and what we need to study.
Well, and I think that brings up another interesting point. There are things like this that are transformative, or maybe even the term transcendent,
Yeah, Yeah.
and we don't understand them, but we
Yeah.
know they exist, and they're deeply hardwired within us. But the fact that we can't necessarily explain it doesn't negate how powerful they are.
Yeah. And, this, the study of awe is really the study of, and it's really, there's a lot of active inquiry right now in the social sciences very broadly of how we transcend ourselves. We are a very self-serving, machine that has been designed by evolution to gratify desires. But as humans, we transcend that all the time. Spirituality, meditation, awe, being out in nature. Interestingly, aesthetics, right? You can go see a film that is, Schindler's List, and suddenly you're like, I'm transformed, even though it was fiction and it's not real. And so we need to understand, start to think about why humans develop this sense of transcendence and getting beyond sensory reality. And I think it's one of the great mysteries that we'll find answers to.
I think it's interesting though, because using even those examples,
Yeah.
and I have used this as an analogy with the Dalai Lama, perhaps unfairly, but it's been my experience is, you have a lot of people, especially in the Western world, who attend events with the Dalai Lama. And, it's like, oh my God, yes, compassion. God, I want to be a better person. I want to do this. And, I'm going to do that. And then, within 48 hours, the feeling is dissipated.
Yeah, I know. I know.
And I think that's a challenge. And is it one because of sort of distractions of quote unquote the real world, not the imaginary world that you're trying to be a benefit to, or is it because there's not a simplicity of resources available that allow you to connect to something that can not only change other people's lives, but changes your life?
Yeah. Yeah. It's when we put together, what we've learned from this contemplative science of the Buddhists, studies of compassion and awe and gratitude and self-compassion and beauty, what we've been talking, nature immersion, we've been talking about today. Work, new frontier work by Dr. Yuria Solidwin, who, thank you for bringing her up, Jim, on what the indigenous traditions teach us about the good life, the meaningful life. We have the pathways, and we can feel it. Like you go to a Buddhist event or a retreat, or you go backpacking, or you listen to me and you're like, wow, I'm changed. And then the challenge is to build it into your everyday life, right? And reality gets in the way for good reason. We have to do good work, in the physical, concrete reality of life, but also it gets in the way because our smartphones don't help us, and the content of CNN gets us distressed and so forth. So people very selectively use the word practice, and I agree. I think we need 10 minutes a day of this stuff. I learned that writing this book, grieving my brother. I was lost, and I just committed myself to 10 minutes. Like, look at a sunset, listen to a great piece of music, go to a new piece of music or visual work. Think about a spiritual teacher or somebody who inspires us. We've got to commit to that, and get it out. We've lost a lot of people in the United States have moved away from religion, especially young people, probably for good reason, according to many. But we need to return to kind of these paths to meaning. Schools don't teach it. My undergrads at Berkeley, I asked them just the deep, meaningful questions like, why would the Holocaust happen? And they're like, what's the Holocaust?
Oh, well,
What do you,
that's
what do you think about the soul? Like, what is the nature of the soul? And they're like, are you allowed to use that word? I'm an engineer, right? We need to return to this stuff deeply. And it's remarkable a neurosurgeon like you would be pushing compassion. And then a social scientist like me would be like, awe is the answer. But we're in need of doing this on a daily basis.
No, I think a challenge for a lot of people is that they'll sense this and then they'll be overwhelmed by, well, I haven't done enough,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
gosh, how could I do that? And there's a interesting book by BJ Fogg. Have you seen it? It's called
Yeah. I've heard of it.
Tiny Habits,
Yeah.
the small changes that change everything.
Mm.
And I think instead of, and this is one of my own tendencies, if let's say I say, well, I'm not in shape, then I go out and try to run 10 miles, right? Which is not an effective strategy because, if you haven't exercised for a long time, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Versus saying, today I'm going to walk just to the to the corner and do that every day. And I think this idea of tiny habits or small changes are what are really powerful and effective
Yeah.
in actually giving
Yeah.
people the tools to impact their lives in a positive way. Even, I tell people typically at the end of one of my talks, regardless of your position, your wealth, every one of us has the ability to change the life of one person
Yeah.
in a
And
positive way.
yeah. And, that comes out of the compassion literature, which we should always be reminding ourselves of. In the literature on awe, one of the most surprising discoveries is what I call everyday wonder or awe in this book, which is people feel it pretty regularly, and we just need to open our eyes. And so the challenge then is to think about the easy ways that don't hurt the environment, that don't cost a lot of money, that you can notice the moral beauty of somebody, right? That you can get out in nature for 5 minutes in cities, in any kind of environment, look to the sky, that you can listen to music with a mind toward finding a little bit of awe. And I believe firmly, and we've done a lot of research on this, even a minute a day of awe. We're just publishing a paper by Maria Monroy in Scientific Reports. A couple of minutes a day helped healthcare providers fend off depression and anxiety during the pandemic, right? Just reminding ourselves, like, wow, there's awe. I feel awe talking to my old friend Jim Doty and just thinking about the themes we've talked about for 10 years. It makes me feel a sense of shared humanity, right? It's always right there, and doesn't cost you anything.
And I think that's the key is it it really doesn't cost anything. But and it gets back even to our larger picture where we're talking about uh, as an example, hunger or homelessness. There's so much
Yeah,
wealth out there that
yeah,
so many of these individuals, it would not even impact their lifestyle. I mean, because, they're very, I mean, what do you need to buy other than out of boredom, right?
yeah,
I mean, once you have, three or four $10 million homes that sit empty 90% of the time, what is it that you're doing versus doing something that is profound, deep, and you know, it's always an interesting paradox to me in America, especially where we have uh, told people or sold a narrative that people with money, power, position are happy. And that's what you should strive for. And that's the definition
yeah,
of success. And of course, as you know, the problem is if you spend time with these people, don't get me wrong, there are some who are extraordinarily happy.
yeah,
But that being said, a large percent of these individuals are miserable. And
yeah,
they think that because there's a subset of society that admires them,
yeah,
therefore they'll show off, whether their house, their car, whatever it is, and then they get this secondary feeling from people. Go, oh man, you're so cool, you're so great, you have everything. Wow, but it's like eating food that has no sustenance
yeah.
because that emptiness remains.
Yeah, and that's why I think that these sciences of and practices and contemplative traditions of compassion and awe and beauty and gratitude and the like are so important. Those states, self-transcendent states, tend to make people more generous. They tend to be lost sight of with rises in power and privilege, and we need to return to them. And again, it's important to remember that they bring about a lot of good at the greater good level of society level. And shouldn't be lost sight of. And I would argue, when I wrote Born to Be Good, one of the people who frustrated me most was Ayn Rand in libertarianism. And she was like, if any civilization is to survive, it's the morality of altruism we have to reject. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, she got it all wrong. And that philosophy tends to prosper a lot in very wealthy corners of
No,
our
I mean, certainly in the libertarian space. But,
Exactly.
it's funny you say Ayn, because I used to say Ayn Rand, and I
Yeah.
wrote something about it one time, or I talked about it. Somebody said, "You're an idiot. You don't know how to pronounce her name." I said, "Oh,
But I'll tell you why she's wrong."
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, this is a battle we have to engage in. And I'm encouraged, always when I talk with you, Jim, but also these things like compassion are ancient, they're intuitive, they're a deep part of human nature. So if we return to them, I think they'll bring about some good in the world.
No, I think that's right. To comment on Ayn Rand, at the end of her life, she was on public assistance.
No way.
Yes, you should. So it reminds me of during the 2007 and 2008 crisis, because I would know these people go, those poor people, they just don't want a job and they're lazy, blah, blah, blah. And these are people who are they're just above the level of doing okay. Then they lose their jobs and they're going, I want prolonged disability payments, and I want a subsidy, and I want that. And it's easy to be critical when you're not in that position. But I think this issue of the reality that it's compassion, it's awe, that frankly is what's going to save our humanity. And if we can convince a few people to take on that message and that burden and promote it throughout the world, I think that will be very, very powerful. And hopefully, I would say if we can just do one act, which is like a drop in the ocean, then we can create a tsunami. I'm still waiting for that tsunami, but I still believe in that possibility.
I hear it coming, Jim.
Well, listen, always a pleasure to catch up with you and see how you're doing. And maybe we can have a side conversation a little bit later about a couple of things I wanted to share with you.
That sounds great.
Thank you for being with me today. I'm very appreciative, and I'm always inspired by your work. And I always wish you the best.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Jim, as always.
Take care, my friend.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Again, thank you for being with us today. The Into the Magic Shop podcast can be found where you find your most popular podcasts, or you can find us at intothemagicshop.com.